Hello, dear ones, and welcome to this expanded states of consciousness through the lens of quantum fields. Okay, so we're going to speak about expanded states of consciousness, and I will post these series of videos to discuss the topic from different perspectives. Mostly, like I said, through the lens of quantum physics and the quantum realm. So allow me to start by explaining why I choose to talk about expanded states of consciousness instead of altered states of consciousness. When we talk about altered states of consciousness, it also includes lower states like dream-like states, induced comas, unconsciousness, alcohol-induced states, things that make us unconscious. Now, the one is not good and the other one bad, but I choose to speak about expanded states of consciousness that feels like it's a higher resonance frequency. I'm interested in that. So there's also really interesting things I feel more inclined to speak about when it does come to expanded states of consciousness. And through talking about them, the polar opposite sides will be understood in some form too. Because we explore the one, like it's so above, so below, right? So before we address expanded states of consciousness, it's super important to address the word consciousness itself, because it has so many different meanings. So it is important to clarify this word consciousness from my perspective, because everyone has their own meaning and everyone draws that own meaning and listens with that meaning when they hear the word consciousness. For example, if you ask a doctor, he will perceive consciousness as your ability to interact with the outer world. And he would use a test asking, how many fingers am I holding up? And from that perspective, it's like you're responding to your senses, the outside world. And that's a different perspective than what I think consciousness is. So if you can answer that question accurately according to the doctor, then you're conscious, because you can respond and your senses can pick up how many fingers you see. And from your perspective, I hope that you can still see 5 fingers, no matter how I hold them. But what about the psyche and the awareness? How do you feel about seeing those fingers? Your ability to perceive that, and do you really see 2 or do you see 5 fingers? So those are all interpretations of that, right? But however, when I refer to consciousness, I refer to the pure knowing awareness, the pure sense of awareness, or the pure ability to perceive. If a sentence could exist only as a verb, without the object and the subject, I would say consciousness has the essence of perceiving, the very act of perceiving. I feel it's very important to verify states, including in our awareness. Okay, so there's 3 states I want to talk about. And these 3 major states can arise within consciousness. And this is awake, dreaming, and dreamless or deep sleep. There is something aware of all 3 these states. And every time that you are aware of one state or another, you observe a different world. So instead of perceiving that you move into a different state, it might be more useful to know that it is a different state that moves through you. So flipping the coin. We'll talk a lot about quantum flips in this too. This is when we are not referring to the body and the mind as the self, but the body and the mind arising within what you are within yourself. The light of awareness. Consciousness doesn't really exist in or at any particular point in space. It is a field of awareness, and that point in space appears within this field of consciousness. So attention can focus down onto a fabricated point through concentration on a particular set of objects. And consciousness can seem like it's narrow or expanding. And when we are trying to use the language to describe the formless, we have to know that we will never be able to grasp what it is with words alone. Words will fall short every single time. All words will always be too limited because they segregate in nature. They call this hand from this ring, this pants, this microphone. It segregates everything. But if we stop looking at the words and we see where they point, then we can use the words to point to what it is, and direct experience will deliver awareness into the formless for direct experience. Okay, so oftentimes consciousness is limited by labeling it. This goes for all labels and all opinions. There is no label or opinion big enough to hold it because it's formless, it's everything. And this goes for absolutely all labels. We only limit what we label. And we do the same thing with ourselves. So then what are expanded states of consciousness? Allow me to refer to the dictionary here. The dictionary said it's a sense that one's mind has been opened to a new or larger kind of awareness associated particularly with a mystical experience, a meditation, a hallucinogenic drug, and also see altered states of consciousness. Okay, so that's the definition, according to the dictionary, of what expanded states of consciousness is. From my bias and perspective, expanded states of consciousness is where we perceive beyond the normal senses, which bring forward an expanded view or perception. I use the word normal here as something that is your personal baseline, or what you come to your baseline of spectrum to regularly. This can be vastly different from person to person. For someone who is colorblind and for some reason experience moments when they can see full color, to them this can be an expanded state of consciousness. Seeing that full spectrum of color, that expanded states of consciousness can be that mystical experience of, wow, I saw further than previously, or I saw deeper into something than I previously used to. So their baseline would be colorblind, and these moments of expanded states of consciousness would be seeing full color. Now, for the person who always sees the spectrum in full color, it is not an expanded state of consciousness. It's their normal baseline. So this is what I mean, that person to person, their baseline is on different frequencies and wavelengths. However, I do want to mention that expanded states of consciousness do not need the brain or the body in order to perceive. The body is a beautiful and a magnificent instrument that can filter and process and gather and interpret information, but it is not the generator of consciousness, as previously believed. There were extensive research done in NDE, near-death experiences, that disproved that consciousness is generated or created by the brain. That's what a lot of people thought. And these people all had out-of-body experiences, and they perceived things even when their body was not able to interpret any of this information at that point. Their body was declared as unconscious or even dead for a period of time. So there was no electricity, magnetism, energy, life force flowing through the body at that point. Consciousness is in constant flux, constant. We tend to notice and take interest in the extreme ends of it. But every single time that you feel a different emotion, that is a different state of consciousness, literally. Now I will name a few ways that we experience altered states of consciousness or expanded states of consciousness. If we look at the first way, it's pharmacologically. So this is through psychedelics, anesthesia, and other kinds of drugs. So using the chemical compounds and altering the chemical compounds within the body. Then we have psychological, which is if you do things like breathwork, hypnosis, meditation. This is on a psychological level. You start altering that. You can also get that through physical. So if you're fasting, if you're having sex, if you have a trauma response or you release trauma, you feel different states of consciousness. Pathological wise is psychosis or epilepsy. You can also have spontaneous through NDEs, disassociation, out-of-body experience, astral traveling, things like that. Now, what happens if we look at expanded or altered states of consciousness from a unified physics lens? Going into the quantum here. Please allow me to explain the very start of physics, of all things really. This is the essential point to start at. There is what is called a zero-dimensional point. It's also called the singularity or the divine plane. It has no length, no width, no height or size, and yet it exists. It only indicates location, but it doesn't indicate any shape, even though the symbol choice of this indicates it as a small dot or circle. The point is pure potential. And at the very heart of this black hole, you also find the singularity. This is the point where everything starts. And it is at this point that has now been proven there is a micro black hole at the center of every single atom. Thank you, Nassim. So from that point, we get other dimensions, even beyond the third dimensional plane. So keeping it very basic and simple, if we expand that singularity out into a circumferential sphere, it looks like, including all dimensions, a bubble around that singularity point. Now, this bubble or this sphere is alchemically transformed into the dynamic flow between the center and the periphery. And in between the singularity point and the periphery, this is all life that exists, the dynamic flow. All life exists here. So the perfect primordial fabric to contain life is within those two polarities. And every point in and out in that outer sphere has the same distance from the singularity. So if this point of singularity or zero-dimensional point is the very start of the manifested, then it also means that it is the end of manifestation to some way and degree, because it is the very point where the unmanifested, so to speak, also starts. This is the most basic and fundamental flow of life in all forms. And we can measure absolutely all that, all other primordial planes within that. Now, please note something very important. Singularity and circumference always, always, always goes together, like the yin and the yang. The one cannot exist without the other. Now, similarly, a vibration has two states, on or off. When we use this model to explain expanded states of consciousness, then the circumference will expand. As easy as that. The sphere will grow bigger. So the radius from the singularity point to the sphere will also grow bigger, expanding. Now, how does this relate to breathworks, psychedelics, and integration therapy, as that is my niche? The inhale can be linked to the singularity, and the exhale can be linked to the circumference. The inhale increases and concentrates, and the exhale expands. So the physiology of the body sometimes makes it challenging to think that it's the other way around, but there are many paradoxes. And in concentration practice like breathwork, the mind can become so singly pointed that the point of singularity falls in on itself and it dissolves. Now, once you lose this center point, you also lose and dissolve the circumference. Why? Because they always go together. The elimination of the singularity or the circumference, doesn't matter which one happens, they both end up disappearing because they always go together. And when this happens, it's the end of duality. This means the end of measuring. So any sense of depth, distance, lines, shapes, division, separation, boundaries, space, time, in direct experience, it will vanish. Why? Because none of them has an inherent existence without the measurement of comparison. It has to have a starting point, singularity, and it has to have an end point, circumference or sphere. Now, as previously discussed, you are rather consciousness as this body arises within what you truly are, instead of being this body and consciousness arising from within the body. So flipping the coin once again. When you dream, this physical body is not with you. You are in a new dream body. You are in a new dream world. And there's new dream characters. Your sense of self is still the same with another body, though, in another world. Even though that world arises within your psyche, the same as this world is projected out of your psyche. Now, this is also why you can recall a memory from childhood and feel that it's still the same you, as a lot of people label that as, I remember it like it happened yesterday. Now, that experience is like, you're not the same body. It's not the same at all. Your body is not even the same as when you started listening to this video. Thousands of cells have been replaced, died off, reproduced. Consciousness does not age because it was never born. And nor can it never die, ever die. So you are the unborn, the already whole and complete. So in yoga or Sanskrit, we call that 𝗱𝗲 Asanga 𝗱𝗲. So these fluctuations of time experience within the body, within it, but we know that we are beyond the body, beyond time. And thus, you are really boundless without any limitations, but you cannot really expand consciousness or awareness. You can only shrink yourself into the appearance of something with a seeming boundary. So consciousness is infinite. It's nothingness. It's faceless. It's formless. And when a drop of water merges with the ocean, the entire ocean is absorbed in the single drop too. This drop doesn't vanish, but it becomes the entire ocean. You are not the only everything and nothing. This is maybe too much to conceptualize for the mind. It's beyond that, so don't try to understand it. You are that which is beyond everything and nothing. Because everything and nothing are still just concepts. It's still just ideas. The direct experience of expanded states of consciousness makes this truth apparent. Please leave a comment, subscribe, like, whatever your heart desires here. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. Until next time, namaste.